9 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is obviously Commercial Leasing 101. Both of you know me. Obviously, I'm a commercial real estate broker licensed on both sides of the river. I personally haven't been investing in real estate since 2011 in residential rentals. I'm adding another one to my portfolio this week, so that's cool. And I got into this business after 15 years in local government. So that's been really a good help, especially on the commercial side of the business, understanding permitting and zoning. And last year, my business partner, Lyle, who's also on the video today, we leased or sold over 500,000 square feet, which I think is like 8 football fields or something. So we had a good year last year. Obviously, both of you know all the legal stuff, not a CPA or giving you tax or legal advice. So I'm just trying to share information that might be helpful if and when you decide you're ready for an office. So today we're going to talk about some basic lease structures, some of the language you might see in a lease or when you're looking at spaces maybe on LoopNet, some of the common challenges that I find that clients might run themselves into, and then an overview of the leasing process, and just in case you're curious how that might work. I know both of you are very familiar with the residential real estate side, but you might not be familiar with what happens when you get to a lease. And then we'll have a few minutes at the end for some Q&A, but like I said, I will be sure to get you out of here at 9 o'clock. So in the chat, if you could put, if you're looking at maybe a first lease, you're looking at another location, maybe shrinking your footprint into a smaller space, or if you're looking at going into a first lease renewal or some other situation, if you could just put a letter in the chat, that'd be great. I mean, I kind of have a feeling, I think I know where you guys might be, but you can just, first lease, that's awesome. I know you have an amazing business plan, Hannah, very, very aggressive and assertive, which I love it. So cool. Hopefully you will be ready to call me then. So thank you, that's super helpful. So there's 3 kind of main leases that you will see when you are maybe poking around or once you start looking into getting into a space. The first is called a full service lease. This is the base rent is going to include all of the operating expenses of the building. So the landlord's taxes, their insurance, the maintenance, their management fee, that's all going to be included in what that base rent is. And so you as the tenant are probably going to pay for like your own internet for your space. But like the janitorial for the restrooms is all included. So that's just the whole kit and caboodle is going to be covered in that. The next type of lease is a modified gross lease, where you're going to pay your base rent, and then there's maybe some utilities that you're going to be paying a share of. Maybe the building is on a common like water meter, so they might just dole out what that water bill is based on the square footage sizes of the tenants in that space. So you're going to pay that base rent plus some other expenses, and every lease is different. So I can't say like, oh, he's in a modified gross, you're going to pay your water bill, because that isn't always the case. It just kind of depends on how they have the building structured or they have the other tenants structured. And sometimes I'm doing a transaction right now where the tenants, we've got 4 on a triple net lease, which I'm going to talk about, and 1 on a modified gross lease. So it's not even always same for each tenant in the building. And then a triple net lease, which is we'll talk a little bit more about, is where you're going to pay a base rent, and then you'll see it advertised as maybe $18 a square foot, NNN, which is pronounced triple net. And so you're going to be paying a additional fee on top of that for the common area maintenance, again, the insurance and the taxes for the building. And so you'll have an extra expense on top of that base rent. So we talked a little bit about triple nets and what that means. So they include, like I mentioned, the property taxes, the insurance, the common area maintenance. And so each property owner is going to have some different common maintenance expenses included in there. Again, it depends on the different buildings. So what might be included in there, they're maybe going to bill back to their management fees, most likely. Any repairs and maintenance that aren't your expense as a tenant. So if they need a new roof, that's going to get billed back all to the tenants. If there's exterior landscaping, the parking lot, resurfacing, snow and ice removal, all of that stuff. So pretty much anything the landlord's going to do, they're going to bill it back all to the tenants. So just know that, unfortunately, you don't have as a tenant any control over what these expenses are. You don't know if they're getting quotes or what they're doing. They could be hiring their best friend to do something, but unfortunately you can see the bills and you can see they're required to give you some projected estimates. But again, you don't have any control of these expenses. You're either going to have an underage or an overage at the end of the year because they're just going to do the best that they can to estimate. So a TI is another term that we use, a tenant improvement. And so when you're negotiating a lease, again, every lease is different. Some landlords will do all of the tenant improvements for you and they'll reflect that in the base lease rate. Sometimes you as a tenant will be doing the TIs. You might get some cash contribution from the landlord. But everything is negotiable depending on your lease term, what you're asking the landlord to do, how much money you might be getting, how much work does the space need? If it's just a very cold shell like in this photo, obviously it's going to be a very expensive tenant improvement project because you're going to be looking at probably putting in restrooms and obviously drywall and some different things. So it really, every lease, again, it depends, but this is the term TIs that we use while we're talking about the business. So some different things, audit rates. I talked about the triple nets. You have the ability as a tenant per your lease to go in and, look at what those bills are and make sure that the charges seem somewhat reasonable. But again, you don't have any control over, which vendors or who they're using for those expenses. Another thing that's very common in this business is usable square footage versus rentable square footage. So typically rentable square footage is you're paying from, pretty much the exterior wall in. So you're paying for rentable square footage, even if it's not all usable square footage in a space. And so sometimes that trips people up because sometimes it gets advertised as rentable square feet, but once you get in there, it might be a little bit smaller than what you were expecting. And then the commencement date, when are you starting that lease? And that may not always be when you're moving in because you might have 6 months of tenant improvements, but your lease is still starting and most likely you're still probably going to be having some expenses, even if you've negotiated some free rent. So I feel like what gets businesses into the most trouble? So when you're looking at space, making sure that the zoning of your use is permitted there. You want to make sure that, if you're an office space and you're trying to go into an industrial park, maybe that's not the best location for you and may or may not be allowed in that particular zoning. So you just want to make sure that you understand that what you're trying to do is allowed in the space. And then not understanding what your own business needs are. Both of you ladies, I'm pretty sure, have business plans, but some people just, are kind of guessing at what their growth might be or thinking where they might be, but they're not sure. And so, they might sign a 5-year lease and then they're really up a creek without a paddle because, now they've signed a 5-year lease and they're outgrowing their space. And it's really, you can try and find a sublease, a subtenant in there, but you might be still sitting on that space for a year while you're paying rent while you're trying to find somebody else to get in there. So making sure that you understand what that is, what your plans are is really important. Understanding the timing is also really important. So your negotiation time, you can spend a few months. I have one client right now I've been working with for 18 months on our lease negotiation. Nothing's been signed. And so, sometimes these things can take a really, really long time. Sometimes the shortest lease I've ever done from start to finish is 30 days. But that's pretty rare to have something happen that fast. When you're looking at a space, you need to be thinking about permits and how long that might take to get permits, architectural drawings, build out if you're putting in office spaces and restrooms and running plumbing and all of that. And then obviously your time to move in and set up. If it's, a dental office, it's a little bit more complex than if you're, just a regular office space user. But those things all take time. And then making sure you understand what your renewal schedule is. Some leases require you as a tenant to let your landlord know, 6 months ahead of time whether you're going to be renewing your lease or not. And sometimes that's, that can catch up on you really quick and you don't know, and maybe you're not sure what your plan is, but making sure you understand what's in your lease. Understanding how expensive things are. Everything costs twice as much and takes twice as long as you think it should. Just like everything else in life, moving can be very expensive, making sure you have that timed right. And then what are the ongoing costs of you being in that space, your utilities, and just understanding that, again, things are more expensive than you should be even on top of what that base rent is. And then obviously the cost of tenant improvements. Tenant improvements can be very expensive. And so a lot of times it's like, well, I just want to move this wall, and now you're looking at a $30,000 project that may or may not require permits and time that you need to be factoring into that process. So I like to talk a little bit about where the market is right now. A lot of tenants come to me and they'll tell me, Andy, that space has been vacant for 2 years. Why is it still vacant? Why can't I just lease that space? Why can't I get a good deal? And unfortunately, when it comes to leasing, not just in this market, but I would say a lot of the time, is the landlord really holds the card. Sometimes they have vacancy insurance and they're getting paid and it's vacant. Sometimes they own the building outright and they don't care that the building is vacant because they've already had it paid for, and it's not really costing them necessarily anything to have it, or as much, because they don't have any liens or any mortgage on the building. So a lot of times the landlords really do hold a lot of leverage in the negotiation. Not to say that tenants can't get something out of it, but landlords are a business and they're operating as such. So usually when it comes to negotiation, the landlords really do hold a lot of cards. Again, thinking about what is your time frame, how long, if you want to be in a space in 2 years, you probably should be thinking about 6 months ahead of that time frame. Okay, what side of town do I want to be in? I want to start seeing what the inventory is. What is is my budget in alignment with what the market is right now? And then understanding all of that and all those pieces that go into it. That gets a little bit more complicated when you're trying to move from one space to another versus your first time into a space. But obviously understanding those logistics is really important. You want to make sure that in your lease you have the ability to sublease the space. Can you put in another tenant in there if you outgrow the space, or unfortunately if you end up not needing all the space, or there's a change in the market or something, and unfortunately you need to do something else. So can you put somebody else in there, or are you stuck if you have to make some changes into the space? Make sure that you understand what the lease says. You need to read the lease. A lot of people just sign legal documents without ever reading them. I remember the first time I bought a house, I was there for like 2 hours because I was actually reading the paperwork, and the lady's like, nobody ever reads this stuff. I was like, well, I'd actually like to know what I'm signing. I felt like I was signing my life away. But the same thing with the lease. You want to make sure that you understand what it says and what are you on the hook for. So any lease, unless you're Nike, Google, Amazon, is a personal guarantee. You are not just signing it in your business name. You are personally guaranteeing. And oftentimes, if it's just you, but you are married, in Oregon and Washington, your partner ends up on those, even if they have nothing to do with the business. So you really need to understand that when you sign a lease, it is a personal guarantee that you are committing to making those payments, and that you are going to be on the hook no matter whether your business succeeds or not. And then the triple nets, you want to make sure that you understand the billing process, right? I mentioned that you're going to be getting a bill for the work and the cost that the landlord has for the building. So what is that billing process? How much notice are you going to get if there's an overage? And of course, if if they've undercharged you and they're trying to catch up. And then of course, when there's an overage, most likely they're just going to apply it to the future. You're not going to get that money back. So you just want to understand what that looks like with those triple nets. And then you need to understand, what does the landlord want? What maybe can you use to your benefit as some type of leverage? That's really, really important. And sometimes you don't know what the landlord wants, without kind of doing a little bit of digging, and trying to figure that out. But those are some questions to ask, to think about, that are important as you go through the process. So what type of space are you looking to lease or expand? I think you're probably both looking for some office space, but these are different kinds of spaces that people often are looking for, a retail storefront, obviously a restaurant or something in hospitality, office, and then manufacturing, industrial. And so, depending on what your business needs are, obviously there's different types of asset classes. And you become more aware of that as you start driving around, when clients come to me and are like, I really want this specific thing. And I'm like, okay, I would love to be able to find that for you on the market and we can look. But once you start driving around, maybe you will realize that there's not as many of those buildings out there that can provide what you're looking for. If you're looking for large space, or a nicer office building, you're looking at certain parts of town, that you're not just going to find those anywhere. Another question that I get is, how do I calculate what the monthly charges are going to be, or what the monthly rent is? Because the way our listing service works is that when I send a listing to you, it'll be sorted by square footage, but then you're going to see something like this. It's going to be $20 a square foot a year plus triple nets. And so people are like, Indy, that seems really expensive because they're just trying to do the basic math for the monthly cost. And so this is, again, listed as dollars per square foot per year. So you got to do a little bit of math. Oops, sorry, so I was trying to move you out of the way. So I need to stop with my mouse. Okay, so if you are looking at leasing a 1,200 square foot office, and that's $20 a square foot a year, you're gonna multiply that out. So your annual rent's gonna be $24,000 a year. Then you're gonna divide that by 12. So you're looking at $2,000 a month to rent that office. But now you also need to add in the triple nets, and they're gonna be approximate when you get the lease. They're gonna tell you it's approximately, $2.50 a square foot a year also. So you're gonna multiply that by the square footage, the 1,200 square foot office you have. So that's $3,000 additionally of triple net. So you're gonna be paying. So, or $250 a month. So when you add those together, even though your base rent's not $2,250, just that's kind of how we think, it's what is my total net going to be, not necessarily divided up. So in a space that's $20 a square foot a year, that's 1,200 square feet for that office space. You'd be looking at paying $2,250 a month for that space. Get asked this a lot again. Should I just sign the standard lease from the landlord? There is not really a standard lease out of any of the leases that I've done in the last 2.5 years. Every lease is different. We have some standard templates that we use in the industry, but landlords obviously can change them, add things. They'll have their attorney put some things in there. So every lease is different. Even if you move from space A to space B and it's owned by the same landlord, not every lease is different because maybe the building has sold. Now you have a new landlord that's going to have a new lease, or maybe they've had an issue with another tenant, so they've changed their lease. So I always tell people you want to make sure that you read it and understand what you're signing, because again, it is your name on the hook no matter what happens to your business. That is a personal guarantee. So I always help my clients. I give them notes. I call things out that I think are important in the lease. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you read it and understand it. Just like any other important document. I talked about this a little bit. Personal guarantee. How often is it required? It is always required. You will not be able to get out of it. I have one client right now she opened an LLC in her name. So it's her name LLC. And she's like, well, that's how I'm going to sign it. So the landlord's not going to let you do that. You can put all the LLCs you want on the lease, but at the end of the day, if you're in default of the lease, the landlord is still going to come after you for a personal guarantee. So it's really important that, again, you understand your business model, your business plan, and your business finances to make sure that you have enough income and money coming in to make sure that you can make those lease payments. It's really important. So you're talking to a landlord or you're working with a broker and the responses you're getting just don't feel really good and you're not really sure, but you really like the space. And I tell people, if this is how the negotiation's going, it's not maybe a good place for you. I was doing the negotiation for a client and the broker was being shady with me, wouldn't tell me what the commission was, wouldn't tell me like, okay, well, what's the starting lease rate? Wouldn't tell me what the landlord was willing to do. And so I felt like the whole time we were negotiating against ourselves because I had no base parameters. And I didn't feel good about the negotiation. And I told my clients, I'm like, I think this landlord's not going to be a good landlord for you. This is kind of like the base communication that we're starting out on. And so that's the feeling that I got. And so it's like, if it's kind of starting out like that, where you don't even have, the brokers don't have trust between each other, or I felt like I couldn't trust him. He probably had no issue with me, but I feel like the personal dynamics are important because it's reflective of what kind of landlords you're going to get. Obviously, some landlords during COVID were gracious with their tenants, probably gave them, discounts, let them pass on paying rent. But there's a lot of commercial landlords out there that didn't do any of that for their tenants. So you just need to understand, what kind of dynamics, because at the end of the day, they're running a business, but they're still people too. And especially if you're dealing more with like a private landlord versus a conglomerate, you just want to make sure that if you're not really getting some good vibes, maybe that's not the space for you. And I think that those personal dynamics are important because that's who you're going to, hopefully they'll leave you alone once you get in there and you're paying on time. But, you still want to make sure what you're jumping into. So I've talked a little bit about this. What is a triple net lease, modified gross, or full service leases? What kind of asset classes are in each of these? And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about these in depth. So a triple net lease is typically a retail space. So you're typically going to find that, in strip malls, shopping centers, those kind of spaces. Typically, again, not always. I do have I'm working with a client right now. He's buying an office building. Oftentimes, those are modified gross or full service leases, but in this particular case, they're triple net leases. So again, everything's different. I'm just kind of talking in generality that a triple net lease is typically a retail space. A modified gross lease, again, is typically a building like I talked about that is maybe on shared meters and they can't separate the meters. But I also know somebody that's in a triple net lease and she owns a laundromat. And so she's super stoked because she's not paying her true cost for the water bill. And I'm like, well, if I was some of those other tenants, I'd be ticked off that my water bill is so high and I'm paying a high percentage. But, I don't think the tenants are sophisticated enough to know it. So she's happy about it. But I think the other tenants don't realize what they're paying. So, in a modified gross, either you're probably maybe included in there some janitorial for the common areas and things like that, but you're going to have some extra expenses for some utilities that are probably metered together. And then a full service lease is what's typically called Class A, which is the nicest office buildings, what's in downtown Vancouver. The Parkway buildings off of Mill Plain are Class A. So a full service lease, again, everything's included in that lease rate. You don't have to worry about adding your triple nets or some extra expenses. And so typically that's what a full service lease will cover, all of that. So both of you are probably familiar as either landlords or in the real estate business with the Landlord Tenant Law. There is no Landlord Tenant Law in commercial. So when COVID happened and people were trying to figure out how they could renegotiate with their landlord or how they were getting kicked out and this, what was going on at that time, there is no Landlord Tenant Law. There is a lot more freedom for commercial property owners to take action against their non-performing tenants if you're not paying. I recently had a past client ask me, he was actually getting evicted out of his space, hey, I have a clause in my lease that says, they can't kick me out. And I said, well, yeah, they can't kick you out if they just don't like your business anymore, but they can kick you out if you're not performing in the lease. If you're not making your payments or you're not making them on time, there are some non-performance clauses in there where the landlord, doesn't have to take you to court, but they can still, remove you from the building. So you want to make sure that you really understand or are in a position as a business owner to get in there because you really don't have any protections like you would if you were in a residential unit where you have a little bit more protections and landlords have to jump through a ton more hoops with tenants that aren't performing than in a commercial situation. Now you're kind of overwhelmed a little bit by the process and you're not sure where to start, what to do, your next steps. So the first step is look at your budget. Do you have enough money to do something? Because even if you look at like moving into a Regis or something, for a 1-year lease, you're paying a premium for that short-term lease. But you just want to understand that what your budget is and that you have enough money to make that next step. Look at your profit and loss, look at your cash flow, and just know that you're going to be okay taking 3 to 5 years of lease payments on. You want to think about the type, the location, the size. Where do you want to be? What part of town? How big do you think something should be? You can walk into a space and be like, oh yeah, okay, I think this would be good for my business. Or, some of us are more visual and spatial than others, but make sure that you understand what kind of space needs that you have in terms of where your business plan is and your growth. And then whether it's me or somebody else, you should work with a broker. It doesn't cost you anything extra. I mean, obviously you're going to be paying for my commission over the life of your lease. That's obviously the cost of doing business for the landlord. But you should work with somebody. If you just call on a sign, they're representing the landlord, not you as the tenant. They might not tell you what you might be able to negotiate in a lease versus, if you have somebody representing you that's familiar with what the market is and what's happening and maybe what a landlord's willing to do. I had a client that had last week that has gone and leased his own space, and we were looking at some new space, and I said, yeah, if you're going to sign a 5-year lease, we should ask for 6 months free. And he's like, free rent? I didn't even know that was possible. I was like, yes, that's why you hire somebody that can, walk you through the process and, advise you on what you might be able to, get in return from the landlord. So start looking and finding the space. Office space is a little bit easier to find right now, smaller spaces versus industrial space. So sometimes, again, depending on what you're looking for, making sure that you have enough time to find that space. And then when you're ready to move forward and say, yes, I'm interested in your raising your hand, the next step is your broker should write a letter of intent. It's a non-binding letter that outlines to the landlord what we want to see in a lease, that free rent, when you want to move in, what kind of business you're going to operate there. If you're asking them to do anything to the space, or you're telling them we're going to do this to the space, so that they just know, like, oh, okay, you're going to put some, cubicles up, or you're just, you're going to put in another bathroom, so that they just kind of know what you envision to do with the space. And again, that's non-binding, so at any time, if you want to walk away from the process, you can. That's the document we use to negotiate, and then from there, the landlord would develop their final lease based on what you've agreed to in that letter of intent. And then after you review it, your broker helps you review it, you sign a lease, and then obviously you take occupancy once you put your security deposits and all of that down on the space. So again, this can happen in as short as 30 days, which is pretty fast, or 6 months, 18 months, really depends on the space, the complexity of the business, what you're trying to do, what your tenant improvements are. There's just, when people ask me about the business, I'm like, everything depends. There's no one stock answer, and it really depends on you and your business and your budget and all of those things. That's it. I ran through it really fast. So I'm available for questions. You can either put them in the chat or take yourself off of mute. But I'm happy to stay on the call. But if you don't have any questions, you can also log off and get 4 minutes back in your day.
That was amazing.
I had a couple questions. You're talking about the commencement date versus the move-in date.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you do need to, I don't know, take 3 months to make it so you can actually work in it. Is it common to have to pay your rent for those 3 months that it's being improved, or is it usually obviously it's up to the landlord, but would you say in general it's common to be able to ask for something like that?
It depends on your length of lease. So the longer the lease you sign, the more willing a landlord's going to, because they're getting a longer term commitment from you. So if you're, let's say, going to sign a 3-year lease, they may or may not give you 3 months, depends on the landlord. Now, if you were going to sign a 5-year lease, probably wouldn't be tough to get 3 months free rent. So it depends, and it depends on the market and the landlord, but I'm always willing to make the request of a landlord, even if I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not going to do crazy. Like, I would never go to a landlord and be like, we want 1 year free on a 5-year lease. Like, no. You might get that if you're going to sign a 10-year lease, right? But not on a shorter term.
And then the other question I had was, what happens if they sell the building? Does it?
So the lease gets transferred. Yeah. So they can't.
What's that?
Gets transferred to the new owner. So they, nothing would change until your lease, until you're at your last renewal. And let's say you have like you have a sign a 5-year lease, and then you have one renewal, so you have up to 10 years. They have to honor what's in those leases. But then after that time, whenever that lease is complete, then if you wanted to stay for another 5 years, then they could use their own lease agreement or set their own rates. So
cool.
Yeah.
Love it. It's awesome. It was a perfect level of, like, a lot of information, but not overwhelming. So it was good.
Well, thank you. And part of my next that I rolled out this year in my series on commercial real estate is I have commercial real estate investing 101. That's if you're looking at purchasing either as an owner occupied space, or you're looking to purchase an investment property. That's on August 9th. Same thing, 9 to 9:30. Quick, down and dirty. How to kind of get started, and some tips and tricks about that process. Because it's sort of, if you're in the real estate industry, there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences too, because the contracts are all different. Different time frames, all of that, just depending on the property and the buyer.
And this was great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for hanging out this morning.
Yeah.
I appreciate your time, and I'm, hope everything goes well with your contractor if they show up today.
Likewise. So obviously I'm just very much in the beginning, just trying to kind of learn, a couple years away still. So what do you recommend for someone in my position, so I can kind of be involved and have realistic expectations when I get to, okay, let's actually do something? Yeah.
So if you're just, when you say kind of stay in touch, are you talking about like what market rates are, or are you talking like what specifically, what are you trying? So I mean, you can.
What's available? What's it going to cost? Where should I be looking? Should I drive around? Like, what's your recommendation to clients?
Yeah, so similar. The tools that are out there for commercial are loopnet.com and crexy.com. You can find some stuff on there. They're only as robust as brokers are willing to pay an additional fee to list them there. So, like if you were just interested, I mean, I'd be happy to run a report and send it over to you like, hey, on average, this is what the lease rates are. I'd be happy to send you just some like general knowledge, or even if you're like, hey, I want to open a space in Camas or East Vancouver, I can send you kind of a range of what's happening in the market. But those two sites, they won't necessarily have everything listed, but at least they'll give you kind of a, pulse on maybe what rates are and, what stuff might be available.
Yeah. Is it common in commercial for things to just kind of stay off market and stay in people's back pocket?
It is common for things to be listed on CoStar, which costs thousands of dollars a month, but not on those other sites because you have to pay to also put, even though CoStar owns LoopNet, we pay to also put it on LoopNet, which is like the Zillow. So not everything is on there because you're like, hey, most likely a broker is going to bring me a tenant, they're not going to necessarily call on a sign.
CoStar
yeah.
is like MLS for brokers only. Correct. Kind of thing. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, good to know.
Mm-hmm. And most, residential agents don't have it because it's just so expensive. And if you're not doing
right, there's no reason for me to have that.
Yeah.
I'll leave that to you.
Yeah.
Hire the professional.
Yeah. So, I mean, I still have, depending on the property we list, like if we have a commercial listing, we put it in RMLS, Northwest MLS, CoStar, LoopNet, like we'll put it there for a listing for sale, not always for lease. It just depends because, obviously you might not be making much on a lease depending on size and length of lease and all that.
Cool.